This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. As far as today is concerned, we're hurrying on to the new year. It'll soon be 2018. But we always need to remember the ladies. This book by Kirsten Olson, published about 20 years ago now, has women with birth dates and death dates for every day of the year. But no one more famous, unless they were before, like in 1995, since it is a somewhat old book now. Still, it's got a lot of great women listed in it. And today I'm going to be talking about several of them. First, I should show you the picture of Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, second President of the United States, and mother of John Quincy Adams, the fifth President of the United States. Remember the ladies was a famous phrase that she used in a letter that she wrote to her husband, John, actually in 1776, when he was working on the Declaration of Independence. He was on the committee with Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson at the time. And she had an admonition for him, what he should remember to do, or, well, actually, of course, he didn't actually take her advice at the time, but she said something like, men would be tyrants if they could. So husbands need to remember the ladies. And not that it was put in the Declaration of Independence at all, but Abigail Adams was always looking out for women. Now, today's women that we're going to talk about most, first is a woman from Southeast Ohio that I know I've told you about before at various times. She was born in Washington County. She married a man from McConnellsville in Morgan County, and then they moved some other places, but she still is our Southeast Ohio lady, Frances Dana Barker Gage, an activist, a Universalist, member of the Universalist Church for a number of years until she finally found that they didn't take good enough position on abolition. She had a triune cause. And the next picture you will see is actually me dressed up in a long black gown given to me kindly by Judy Daso, which I've worn on several occasions when it seemed like I ought to appear to be a 19th century person, 19th century woman. And this particular picture of me as Frances Dana Barker Gage was taken in March of 2005 when there was a special event at Hocking College at which women took the roles of famous women in history, and I took the role of Frances Dana Gage. Now, she was an interesting person because she had what she called a triune cause. Three, that is to say, three things that she was famous for writing about and speaking about. And she was a well-known person in her time who wrote for Columbus newspaper under the sobriquet of Aunt Fanny. Of course, that refers to her first name, Frances, because women named Frances were often called Fanny. she she wrote variously, and as I say, she spoke around the country as well. In her time, she was born in 1808 in Washington County, not very far from Marietta, and that's where she grew up. She had just a couple of years of schooling in a one-room school, I guess, but she was one of those girls who loved to read. I know those girls pretty well because I was one myself. I read everything I could, and in fact, I read Heidi many times. And just the other day, my daughter-in-law, Heather Johnson, happened to mention that she had read Heidi many times. First time that I realized that she and I had that particular historic, shall we say, connection, because we were fond of books, but the books that we liked best, we read over and over. In fact, I remember as a little girl when we moved to Fallon, Nevada, that was the first place where there was a public library in my young youth. I was about 10 at the time, maybe a little younger, and there was a public library in Fallon, Nevada, which is right on Route US 50, about 2,200 miles west of here, because Fallon, Nevada has Route 50 going through it, just like Athens does. And I set a record, according to the librarian, because we could only check out one book at a time. And it was summertime, and I wasn't in school, and I had some time, and I wanted to read. So I checked out a book in the morning from the library and took it home and read it, took it back, checked out a second book from the library, took it home and read it, took it back, and checked out a third book from the library, took it home, read it, and took it back. And the librarian said I'd set a record for people checking out books on the same day and returning them on the same day. So you can see I was quite a bookworm as a girl. But the picture that shows me as Frances Dana Gage is there we go again, me wearing the dress that Judy gave me so kindly. And Frances Dana Barker Gage, she was, her maiden name was Barker. The Barkers had been among the pioneer families of Ohio since her parents moved to Marietta, or the near Marietta actually, in 1789, and that was the first year that there were white settlers, permanent settlers, and permanent settlements in the state of Ohio, both in Marietta and also in Cincinnati, Ohio River communities. Well, Frances Dana Barker, later Gage, married a man who was a lawyer in McConnellsville and lived in McConnellsville a number of years. Now, it's interesting to me that I thought, well, gee whiz, if they lived in McConnellsville, I wonder if they might be mentioned in one of the histories of Morgan County. So one day I went to McConnellsville and their library and looked at a book on the history of Morgan County. Sure enough, they mentioned James Gage of McConnellsville, who had been a lawyer there in the 1820s and 30s and 40s probably. And it was interesting that the historian who actually wrote up the people who were being spotlighted in that particular history. He wrote in the 1890s, which was, quite some years after James L. Gage and his wife, Frances Dana Gage, had passed on. He didn't have too much good to say about James Gage as a lawyer, and didn't mention his wife at all, who was a pretty famous person in her own day. She was the chairwoman of a women's rights meeting held in 1851 in Akron. That was the second women's rights meeting in Ohio, and remember, the first national, as far as our nation is concerned, the first women's rights meeting was held in 1848, just a couple of years earlier. It was held in New York State. So Frances Dana Gage was not mentioned at all in this Morgan County history, although the next person, who was also a lawyer in Morgan County, had considerably more information about himself, and they also talked about his wife. So, how people fall out of history, especially women. Obviously, Frances Dana Gage had fallen out of Morgan County history by the time 1890s rolled around. But as I say, she was a famous person in her own day and chaired the second women's rights meeting held in Akron in 1851 in the spring. And that was the meeting at which Sojourner Truth made the famous talk sometimes called "Ain't I a Woman?" She was facing down the men who had kind of taken over the meeting, telling the women they should stay in their place, let the men run the roost and run the household and so forth and so on. And she gave them something to think about. For instance, one fellow had said, Christ wasn't a woman. What are you talking about? Women should do this and do that. They should probably shut up in church and certainly not be ministers and so forth and so on. He'd gone on like that. And Sojourner Truth looked at that man and said, "Where did Christ come from? From God and a woman. And man had nothing to do with that." So that was one of the ways that Sojourner Truth put down the fellows who were taking over the women's rights meeting in 1851. And the audience really liked Sojourner Truth's comments. They say that there was a great clapping and stamping of feet and so on at the end of her short speech in which she defended the women. Well, Frances Dana Gage went on to write. In fact, it was the next year, it was in 1852, that she wrote a song, a poem, but it was a poem that was made for the Hutchinson's family singers, who were well known in that day and traveled the country singing songs, and Frances Dana Gage wrote a song for them about women. And she predicted like this: 100 years hence, what a change will be made. Our laws then will be uncompulsory rules, our prisons converted to national schools. Lying, cheating, and fraud will be laid on the shelf. Men will neither get drunk nor be bound up in self. Then woman, man's partner, man's equal shall stand. while beauty and harmony govern the land. Oppression and war will be heard of no more, nor the blood of a slave leave his print on our shore. Well, 100 years hence, from the time she wrote that, would have been 1952. There was no more slavery, of course, but we had just finished several decades of war and rumors of war and the triumph of fascism in Italy and Germany in the 1930s and so on. So I don't think that Frances Dana Gage was much of a prophet, really. But she was certainly an idealist. And in fact, in 1876, there was a big celebration held in Philadelphia celebrating the centennial of the Declaration of Independence, of course. The women's rights people had tried to be included in the celebration. But the men said, oh no, you know, this is our celebration. After all, there weren't any women involved back in 1776, and why should we include you women's writers in our celebration of the Declaration of Independence? So the women organized their own meeting in Philadelphia, right on the sort of the spur of the moment. They went to a local Universalist church and announced the meeting to be held by women, for women, and to celebrate independence of all men and women. And actually, the Hutchinson's family singers happened to be in town at the time. And in celebration of this big impromptu meeting that the women had in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1876, centennial of the Declaration of Independence, they sang the song that Frances Dana Parker Gage had written in 1852. I didn't read all of it, but I think you got the flavor of it, you know, and even though she wasn't a prophet in her own time, of our time, she had some pretty spicy things to say, and I think that we should remember Frances Dana Gage, our local Southeast Ohio 19th century women's rights champion. Now, I want to talk about another 19th century woman, actually, born in 1860, and her name was Charlotte Perkins Gilman. We have a picture of her as a young woman. This is Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She was born in Connecticut and ended her days, I believe, in California. She traveled the United States. She was a speaker and writer, and she wrote at least 3 famous writings that have survived. In addition, she spent about 10 years writing a journal, a women's journal, in which she wrote everything. She wrote the histories and the biographies and the essays and the poems and the ads even. She got some ads, and she wrote those too. She was born in 1860 in Hartford, Connecticut, and today I'm wearing my Connecticut t-shirt because my Connecticut t-shirt is the right color for the times, and it's from the right spot. This is red and green, basically. We're still remembering Christmas just a couple of days ago, with New Year's coming up soon. And Connecticut was, Hartford was where Charlotte Perkins Gilman was born. And Connecticut is where my Rani forebears came. I had one who lived near Connecticut, near Middletown, Connecticut, and who came to, permanently moved to Ohio in 1830. It was John Rani of New Albany. His farm was near New Albany on that road that runs from northern Columbus over to Newark, 161, which I have visited in the past. And there's an old Universalist church there actually too, which the Ranis were quite active in when they lived in those parts in the 1840s. Actually, it was before that particular church was built, because it only dates from 1890. But there were traveling Universalist ministers who often stayed with the Ranis when they were going around Ohio and doing their preaching. So I feel like I have that Ohio connection and that Connecticut connection. And Charlotte Perkins Gilman, as I mentioned, wrote 3 well-known pieces of literature. The earliest one that is still remembered is called The Yellow Wallpaper, and I'll have some more to say about it soon. She also wrote, that was written about in the late 1880s, early 90s. She also wrote in the late 1890s a book called Women and Economics, because she was quite interested and involved with the importance to women of having their own jobs and their own money and doing their own things. Women and Economics, dating from just the last years of the 19th century. And then in 1915, she wrote a book called Herland. And this book of Herland was a utopian book, a book of utopia. Utopia. Utopia was a famous book written in the 16th century about a place that was not a real place. It was an ideal place. So utopias are books about how things could be if everything was really, really great. Maybe we'd live in an actual utopia. We never have, of course. But Perkins's utopia was called Herland, and it was a woman's utopia where there were no one but women. It was supposedly set in about 2,000 years before the current times, and so how do they have babies without any men around? Supposedly, in this Herland utopia, the babies were just born. They didn't have any fathers who were male. Of course, that is particularly a utopian idea, that there were no men at all around. But actually, she finished her Herland fantasy, utopia, by having a couple of men show up. And as I say, it was supposedly set in a couple of thousand years before the present time anyway. 1915 was when it was published by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. But as you can see, she wrote very different kinds of works. And The Yellow Wallpaper is probably the best known of her writings and the one that has lasted the longest. Now, when I was a young girl out west and reading everything I could lay my hands on, one of the nice books that was there that had belonged to my father, the late Edgar B. Diamel, was a book of stories, and it was in that book, quite a thick, leather-bound book about sort of famous short stories were included, including, I remember reading The Pit and the Pendulum, which of course is a famous horror story. Well, The Yellow Wallpaper was a horror story, actually. Not all the stories in that book were horror stories, but I especially remember reading two horror stories, one of which was The Pit and the Pendulum, and the other of which was The Yellow Wallpaper. And I never forgot the story because it's really such a horrible story. You can't get it out of your mind. But what I had forgotten was the title or who wrote it or whatever. And it was many years later, here in Athens, when I was getting ready to have a summertime humanities conference at Ohio University in 1977, that I was asking various people for suggestions of works that we might read, works that were of about women, of, by, for women. And someone suggested, in fact, I think it was Susan Crowell, suggested The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Well, I started to read the story, and I thought, oh, I've read this story before. I remember reading it when I was just a little young girl out west, quite a long time before, at least 30 years, maybe 40 years before. And so the basic idea of The Yellow Wallpaper is a story of a woman's descent into madness. Well, what did the yellow wallpaper have to do with it? The yellow wallpaper was in an attic in a house, and a woman who had recently had a baby and was very depressed. You know, there are some women whose after their baby is born, have what they call postpartum depression. It's I never experienced it myself, but I understand it's happens sometimes, and is very distressing, of course, especially if a woman is very busy, should be being very busy taking care of a new baby and so on, but is depressed so much that she scarcely can keep herself going, much less take care of a baby. And in the old days, the remedy for postpartum depression was isolation. The cure was supposedly to have a woman that was suffering from postpartum depression stay by herself, do nothing, just rest up, sleep, eat, and that's about all. She wasn't supposed to do anything either useful or fun, like read or paint or have guests or anything along that line. She was just supposed to be by herself for a long period of time, and that should cure the postpartum depression. Well, I don't know how many women were actually cured by by this terrible rest cure where they were not supposed to do anything. They were not supposed to read or do anything except be by themselves. But that was a rest cure that was prescribed for Charlotte Perkins Gilman herself when she suffered from postpartum depression after the birth of her only daughter. And it was with that memory in mind that she wrote a short story called The Yellow Wallpaper, about a woman who was in her room by herself all the time. Every once in a while someone would shove in some food for her to eat, I suppose, and so on, take away the potty pot. But this room had yellow wallpaper on it and was patterned in such a way that there were sort of like bushes and trees and fences and so on, all of a yellow color, and sort of in between blank spaces, so to speak. And the woman who was shut up there in the story of the yellow wallpaper began thinking that there was someone behind the bushes and trees and so forth in those blank spaces. There was someone there, but she couldn't quite make out who it was, and she would stare at the wallpaper, and sometimes she thought she saw movement and so on, and she began going around the room, just walking around the room, all four sides of which were papered with yellow wallpaper, kind of looking to see if she could see what was behind the wallpaper, what there was that was moving there. And she became absolutely fascinated with it, so that finally she was walking around the room, constantly walking around the room. And eventually the people, who were feeding her and so on, came in and discovered that she had gone absolutely crazy. She was circling the room continuously with her hand on the wallpaper and just going around and around and around the room, and had descended into real madness. Well, that was the story of the yellow wallpaper. And if you ever want to read a horror story about a woman who goes mad, I very much suggest that you try reading The Yellow Wallpaper by by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Yes, there's her picture again as a young woman. As I said, she was a well-known author and speaker from about the late 1880s until after the publication of Herland in 1915. Then she sort of fell out of favor, like a lot of women, like someone like Frances Dana Gage falling out of the Morgan County history that had a slight, only a slight paragraph on her husband, who had been a Morgan County lawyer. So she did speak around the country a good deal, and like I say, she for a number of years wrote this it was called The Forerunner, actually. It was a periodical, and as I mentioned, she wrote every word in this periodical, whether they were essays or stories, poems, or even the ads, was done by her from about 1905 to about 1912 or thereabouts. She was very occupied with that. But by the 1920s, she seemed to be kind of old-fashioned. You know, she fell out of favor. Everyone was talking about, by then, in the 1920s, they were talking about Freud and Freud's ideas about women, and how Freud had had famous or infamous, as the case may be, women patients back in the 1890s, and he was considered to be the big expert on women and their problems. And someone like Charlotte Perkins Gilman was passé, beside the point. When she was an old lady, she lived with her daughter. Her daughter was raised actually by the father and the father's second wife, who was a friend of Charlotte's. And but she, you know, she was certainly not separated or from her daughter for her whole life. She saw something of her, although she did not take care of her when she was a baby because of this terrible postpartum depression that she had had at the time. And she lived with her daughter when she was an old lady out in California. And finally, she must have been 75. Let's see, she was born in 1860, and she died in 1935. And she took her own life. She was dying, that is to say, she wasn't actually dying yet, but she contracted cancer, and she knew what the end would be like because she had known other people who had had cancer, and of course treatment for cancer was not very far advanced in the 1930s. So she decided that she would end her own life before she came to die of cancer herself. And so she did that. She was a determined person, as you can tell by the story of the things she did do in her life, her important writings and speaking and so on. So she took, well, I'm not sure exactly what, but obviously one of those drugs that puts people to sleep forever if you take too much of it. If you take a little bit of it, maybe it'll help you sleep at night, but if you take too much of it, you never wake up. So that was the end of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, born in Connecticut, famous author in the 1890s, 1910s, and the author of The Yellow Wallpaper, the horror story about women and a woman who became crazy because of being shut up in a room with nothing to do except run around the room and worry about what might be behind the yellow wallpaper that you could see through the bits and pieces of it. So those are two people that I wanted to talk about today in particular. But in my book, Remember the Ladies, obviously there is a woman for every day of the year. And so we ought to take a look at some others here. Let's check, for instance, on today's date. Today is December 28th. December 28th. Here's someone I don't know of. Actually, she died in 1814, but she was a famous preacher in her day. She was a real evangelist, in her day, and her name was Joanna Southcott. She made it pretty famous. Let's see, who's next? Well, we have Elizabeth of Russia. Now there's a woman. She was the wife of Peter the Great. In fact, she was his widow after he died. She had been a German princess and was married to Peter the Great of Russia in the 18th century. She was born Elizaveta Petrovna in 1709. Oh, whoops, I made a mistake. She was not the wife, she was the daughter of Peter the Great. And Peter the Great had actually conceived this little girl before he was married to her mother, but he later, when she was just a toddler, he married her, the mother, according to this. And so she was the daughter of a famous emperor. But this kind of strange business about being born illegitimate makes it seem like it would have been odd for her to ever actually occupy the imperial throne in Russia, but she did. And she was Empress of Russia for many years. Born, as I say, in 1709. She lived for most of that century. She was still, she was, oh, here we go. She was the mother of Catherine the Great. She was Elizabeth the Great, Peter's daughter. But then when she married, she had a daughter named Catherine, and it was Catherine that became the Great. So I got to brush up on my Russian history here, I can see. That was the 29th of December. Let's see if there's someone interesting on the last day of December. Well, Elizabeth Arden. Elizabeth Arden was a Canadian-born woman, and they think, now she was one of those women who wouldn't tell what her age was when she hid it very much. I don't know that women do that this much nowadays, but when I was a girl, there were a lot of women who would never tell anyone how old they were, and it was very impolite to try to find out someone's age. It was considered quite rude when I was a girl to try to find out some woman's age. Elizabeth Arden, it says she was probably born in 1878, but she set up a famous cosmetics firm, and it was named for herself. She revolutionized the cosmetics industry, it points out, between 1920 and 1940. So when I was a girl, Arden Cosmetics were quite well known. Now let's see who else we have here. Okay. Oh, here's someone wonderful. For the 27th of December, Marlene Dietrich, the German-born actress. She was born in Berlin in 1901, and it says that a movie poster was banned in the 1930s in Paris because it showed her legs. She was famous for having beautiful, beautiful legs. Certainly, she was definitely around as an actress when I was a girl, and that's what she was most famous for. Not so much for her face and so on, although she has certainly had a very nice face too. But she left Germany, and it was a good thing because by the time she was in her 30s and a famous actress, Hitler came to power. And he had no use for her, and she had no use for him. So she, when her movies were banned in 1936, she severed her ties, basically, with Germany. Although after the end of World War II, she did some very important rehabilitation work in Germany, Marlene Dietrich. She and Bob Hope used to tour during World War II. They would tour places where American and British and, servicemen were resting up, recuperating. Bob Hope, who is, I understand, going to have a big TV show coming up soon, and was had certain associations with Ohio, although he was born in England. And he lived to be a very, very old gentleman. He was over 100 when he died, Bob Hope. And I remember him well, of course, from the days of radio, when he and Bing Crosby and also made a number of movies called Road to Such and Such a Place, Their woman, who was in those road pictures, was Dorothy Lamour. Dorothy Lamour, and that last name means love. L'amour, the love in French. Dorothy Lamour was the famous partner in the road pictures of Bing Crosby and Bob Hope. But Marlene Dietrich, as I said, was born in Germany and left during the Hitler times, definitely. She was already making movies in Hollywood by then, of course, and not welcome back to Hitler Germany, and she certainly didn't want to go back there either, but she did do wonderful war work, entertaining the troops and so on, and helping with rehabilitation of Germany after the war. Her birth date being yesterday, the 27th of December. Now, who do you suppose was born on Christmas Day? Well, she was an American. She was famous. She was made most famous, probably, she was a nurse, okay? We're circling in. 19th century nurse, active in the American Civil War. And she was the founder of the American Red Cross. Of course, I'm talking about Clara Barton. Clara Barton, who was a Universalist and born on Christmas Day itself in 1821. And she began doing nursing and quite early, in her teens actually. She was the person who organized the hospitals and the field hospitals, helped organize both those for the northern side in the American Civil War. So we need to remember Clara Barton in these closing days of December as well. Here's a picture of a young girl. Now, this girl was someone that I'm sure you've never heard of. Her name was Teresa Carreño, because she was a child prodigy way back when. It says she was born in Venezuela in 1853, the Valkyrie of the piano. She gave her first New York recital at age 8. I would call that pretty prodigious, all right. And this is a pretty picture of her. She has pantalettes because, like I say, she was born in 1853, and that was a time in the 1860s when young girls wore relatively short dresses, you know, that might come to their knees, but they also wore decorative pantalettes that were obvious, you know, below the skirts, where the skirts ended. You could begin to see the pantalettes themselves. That was a very popular, obviously, very popular in the 19th century. I'm not too sure when pantalettes went out of style, but they certainly weren't around when I was a girl, luckily. Now let's see, who else might we have here? Oh, here's Mary Livermore. She was a famous 19th century women's rights activist and a famous abolitionist as well. Author, educator, temperance advocate, and feminist. Mary Livermore. Her maiden name was Rice, and she was born in Boston in 1820. Because she was active that whole time, and obviously she was married. And it says she married a Universalist minister, Daniel Livermore. She led 4 major woman suffrage and temperance organizations. And during the Civil War, she helped organize women to aid as nurses, the Union cause. So, we have quite a few people now. Oh, here's someone else born in December, the 16th of December. This is one of my very favorite authors, Jane Austen. Jane Austen, December 16th, 1775. She died relatively young, but of course she wrote at least 6 novels that people read today. She didn't write under her own name when she first published, but her name became quite popular and has continued to be popular, if anything, more popular than ever in the 1990s and so on. Jane Austen, December 16th. Well, what are we coming up to? New Year's Day? Maria Edgeworth, born in Oxfordshire, England in 1767. She became quite a well-known author in her time. And it says she had to go to extraordinary lengths to prove that she was pure at heart, because she wrote novels, and novels have to have sensational things in them, don't they? And can a person really write about sensational things if they've never happened to them personally? Well, of course they can. And Edgeworth was a good example of that person who could write sensational books, but not having experienced them herself. So we're getting along to the end of the year, we're getting along to the end of the day, and we're getting along to the end of this program, because my program lasts about 1 hour, and I hope that you're having a nice, although very chilly, end of December. I noticed it said 19 degrees on my car when I was driving over here, and it's been colder than that the last couple of days. I remember seeing a reading of 14, so we're probably going to be going down even less than that tonight. So everyone needs to keep warm, keep bundled up, drink some hot chocolate or do something, have good hot soup, something to keep the winter chill away, so that you're all set for New Year's Day, which will be on the 1st of January, which is next Monday, the 1st of January. So Happy New Year. Have a nice New Year's Eve on Sunday, the 31st of December. And a very happy New Year to one and all for 2018, coming up on Monday. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.